It needs to be that low. Hi, my name is Chris Brancolini. I'm the Dean of the Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to the opening program and reception for our fall exhibition, Mark Twain. This is the program. This is a different title, Mark Twain and the Making of the West. And so we have a number of interesting things for you this evening, and the gallery is open, so we'll invite you to see the exhibition after tonight's presentation if you haven't seen the exhibition yet in the open gallery. We have a reception. There'll be plenty of food later for you. We also have a discussion. One thing I wanted to remind you of is that for every event, we do these little evaluations. You have these little white pieces of paper on your seat. We invite you to give us some feedback on tonight's presentation and put it in that box over there. And at the end of the semester, we do a drawing for a $100 gift card. So there are incentives involved. Another thing I'd like to mention is that there is a display of books by poetry, Reflections on Roughing It, created by student employees here in the library, just outside the door and to your left. So there's plenty to see tonight, plenty to think about, and welcome. I'm happy to have you. Next up is the introduction to our exhibition by Dominic Beaudine. He's the curator and an LMU graduate student. Welcome, Dominic.
We're going to have to raise this. How's that? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Awesome. So I just want to thank everyone for coming again. It's fantastic to see all this work that I and so many others in special collections have done and see it finally up as a final product. And I was sitting here thinking, trying not to be nervous obviously, and a funny story sort of came to me that I think that I'll share. So this past summer, I went with my family to go camping up at Sequoia National Park. And we stayed a few nights outside at this town, or in this town called Three Rivers. And there's something you need to know. She's not here right now, but I have a little sister. She's 12, and she loves dogs. And I mean, like, really loves dogs. To the point where we have to hammer the point home that whenever we're camping and you see a dog, you need to politely go up to the owner and ask, "Can I pet your dog?" And it happens so often that I always joke about it with her, and she gets a little bit mad at me, but it's, you know, it's my job as a brother. But on the last day of the trip, I decided to go to the town museum. And what's interesting about the town museum is that everything inside of it is, or was, owned by past residents of the actual town. And so you'll find things in there such as a yearbook from the origin of the town or its school, and to things like a old dentist chair and utilities, which is as horrifying as it sounds, but also kind of cool. And as I was making my way around, I noticed this beautiful desk cabinet combination. It's the one where you, it's the one where you have your desk here, and attached right above it is a shelf, and attached right above that is a cabinet. And on the shelf were these beautiful old books that were categorized by the color of their cover, like blue, green, and red. And having been in special collections as an English major, I was like, books. And so I go and I look, and as I look at the blue books, I noticed the name Hart. And so I went a little closer, and sure enough, there was Bret Hart. And I was thinking, well, if we're in a mining town, and I see Bret Hart, and so I moved over towards the green books, and sure enough, staring in front of me was Mark Twain's Roughing It. And at this point, I really felt like I owed my sister an apology, because the second I saw that book, I got up, walked over to the front desk, and asked the lady, "Can I pet your books?" But really, it's so fantastic to have this opportunity in special collections. I remember learning so much and doing so much, and some of my favorite things was when the rare book collectors would come through and Cynthia would ask me to come with the rest of the special collections faculty and be passed around these books, and I got to pet all these old books and hold this history in your hand. And it was really great because when I was at the museum, I told them, hey, I worked in LMU Special Collections, I know how to delicately handle books, and they let me go through the books. And so I sat down, and I must have been there forever, because sure enough, the woman at the front got up and came around and was so excited that someone was taking this much time to look at these books when everyone else passes it. And she started to talk to me, which, if you know me, is a horrible plan, because that's like rule number one. You don't open up a potential conversation with me on something I'm very passionate about, because I unloaded information. I talked about what volume this was. I talked about how he wrote it 10 years after actually going on the journey. I talked about how the little letter and number in the right-hand corner was signifying a special type of printing press and folding method that was only used in certain times that I learned from Alex down on the first floor, our librarian, and while I was searching the bibliography of American literature. And none of that would have been possible without my time here in Special Collections, and for that I'm extremely grateful. Now, I also want to talk about, obviously, my time here and explore how the exhibit that's on display started from just a simple meeting with Cynthia. And so, before I actually began working, Cynthia wanted to meet with me because we had never met before, and we wanted to get a head start on things. So we decided to meet in the summer before the school year. And we were talking, and she talked to me about what's involved with the job, and that curating an exhibit is a long and difficult process. So she started by asking me a simple question, which was, what type of literature do I like? And although I'm getting my master's in rhetoric and composition, I do love American literature. And so we were on that topic. And some time passed, and almost simultaneously, we came to this idea of Mark Twain. And she talked to me about how the library hasn't done an exhibit focused on a single author in a long time. And I really enjoyed Twain's style of satire and the challenge that comes from choosing a very heavy and controversial figure. So, needless to say, we went for it. And that's how the idea of Mark Twain began. But immediately I knew that I wanted to do something different. I wanted to avoid the normal standard that comes with Mark Twain when you see him in an exhibit. The Huckleberry Finns, the Tom Sawyers, and all of the things that come with him. I wanted to move away from the Mississippi. And so I read. I read books about Twain's letters to Howells. I read current scholarship around Twain, so I knew sort of what was being talked about at the time. And I also read as many letters from the online database of Mark Twain's letters in the Bancroft Library online. Until it was so much up here that, of course, I had to let it all out here. And I would vent continuously to Mario, who worked in Special Collections behind me. And anytime the faculty of Special Collections was working the front desk and I was in the reading room, I would ask them, well, what do you think about this idea? Would you want to walk through his exhibit that did this? Would you want to do this? Until all the information that I had gathered about Twain finally just came out. And soon enough, I came across this book called Lighting Out for the Territory, How Samuel Clemens Headed Out West and Became Mark Twain. And it's by Rory Morris Jr. And I really enjoyed that idea. And so I went to Cynthia with it, and she told me that we actually have Roughing It in our collection. And from that point, Roughing It became the focus of this exhibit. Excuse me. Now, at this point, I was very intrigued with the idea of Clemens going out west and becoming Mark Twain. But the major rare books donor, T. Marie Chilton, actually only had Bret Harte in a collection of American Western literature. which means today all the books, or most of the books that you'll see in the exhibit, were acquisitions gained by Archives and Special Collections specifically for this exhibit. And it's fantastic because not only was I able to curate an exhibit, but I can leave some sort of lasting legacy in Special Collections, something that has given me so much I can finally give back, even though they purchased the books.
That's okay.
Thank you. One of the books that we had to get, because it is so critical, was The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And the reason why it's so important was it is the book that brought Mark Twain to national attention. And so, of course, we needed to go ahead and grab that. But what's even cooler to me, something I didn't know, was at the time when he wrote it in his cabin on Jackass Hill, California, after hearing about the story in Angel Camp, which means California can own him, or does own him, as a Californian author. And that's something I did not know before having this position. The other book that I really want to talk about is not an acquisition, but was a rediscovery in the library catalog and a personal favorite event of mine. And that is the Mark Twain scrapbook. And I had never known that Mark Twain made a scrapbook before this. But afterwards, I can't believe how I didn't know this. It's this beautiful green book. You'll see it in there. And it means it is very significant in scrapbooking history. But for me, it's very important because the first time we brought it up, I sat down in the reading room and I opened it and I just started reading all the little scraps that somebody at the time put in. And they were newspaper clippings, brochures, anything. And after a while, I noticed that my head started to hurt, my eyes were straining. Why is this happening? And so I sat back up and I looked at the time, and I realized that I had been sitting without drinking any water, nothing, for 3 hours, reading these tiny little fonts in this book. And I feel like as professors, as researchers, as students, we get so caught up in research being a means for an end that we forget why we started it in the first place. That's how it was for me. And when this happened, I remembered why I chose this scholastic route. I remembered why I found research so much fun. Because I wasn't actually looking for this. We stumbled upon it, and we just found it and started reading it. And it was so much fun. And that is why I love this piece so much. Now, one of the coolest parts about this position is how ideas and concepts begin to change over time. I remember in many meetings with Cynthia bouncing ideas off one another as we accumulated more and more information. And as we went through this whole time, I was writing with the idea of how the West made Mark Twain. But as I wrote more, and as I read Roughing It more, as well as other items, and as I compiled materials, I realized that wasn't the case. It wasn't that I hadn't been actually writing how the West made Mark Twain. It seemed when I took a step back like I was actually writing how Mark Twain made the West. Specifically talking about the narrative that he was creating about the West, using his satire and a parody journalism style. A narrative that grew to be as popular as it was problematic. And this is where the true challenge began. With Twain being a window into the West and being an architect of its narrative, that means he represents all of the West. Not just good, not just bad, every part of it. It was vital for us to acknowledge the impact that not only Twain but Roughing It had on marginalized groups, such as the indigenous nations. I had the opportunity to go to an event 2 days ago given by the Bellarmine Forum titled On Native Lands and focused on environmental justice and indigenous communities. And on that panel was our own Dr. Voyles. And she said something very important that she called this politics of memory. And what that is it's not only what's important or what's remembered about a group of peoples, but how they're remembered, because that tells their story to everyone else. So if we not only do a poor job of telling that narrative, but also memorialize them as if they're gone, we're actively disregarding our responsibilities and begin to justify past actions, which meant that it was absolutely crucial for me to consider what narrative I was spotlighting in this exhibit and to constantly critique it, which is the reason why we bought the book Pietoia, which is the beautiful cover right here. And what it is it allowed, or it helped to try to have the Goshute peoples, which is a indigenous nation that Mark Twain satirized, to speak for themselves and give us the telling of their own narrative. And with this, we hope that we could start to take the beginning steps to decolonialize the narrative that's being presented upon the peoples. And hopefully later today, you'll see that the talk between Dr. Peters and Dr. Voyles is another step that we can take towards that end. As the role started, as my role started to close, I began organizing my materials and shifting them into groups to what would be the cases that you'll see in the exhibit today. And each case has a theme that is characteristic of the qualities of the West that Twain was creating. And the problem was, it had to do with space. I couldn't control where readers went, because you could start at anywhere in the exhibit. So if I wanted to have the readers feel some sort of adventure or some other idea, I needed to have each case available for any person to start on any one of them. And that brings us to labels. And so labels. I have a love-hate with labels. Labels are the texts that accompany an artifact or tell the reader what the theme of the case is. And they are... Hello. No worries. And these things can be their own literary genre, because confining all this information into a tiny amount of space is very difficult, especially for me, because I am and love to be very dramatic. And I remember going into many meetings with Cynthia and with these proposed labels and having them shredded by our expert marksman in critical label analysis. She is fantastic at labeling, but as you'll see, we all tend to write linear narratives. And especially for English majors, that's especially so. And what then, as I said before, I can't control where readers begin, so each label needed to stand alone by itself. And like I said, that's very difficult for me, because I would also begin many, many meetings with Cynthia saying, like, okay, I know that we want to do this, and we had talked about this, and we're all on the same page about doing this, but what if we did anything else? And it was difficult for me, I'm not going to lie, but Cynthia made sure that I succeeded, even though some of the labels still remained longer than usual. Now, I remember checking my work over and over and over and over and over again, because while this exhibit is my work, I don't necessarily just represent myself. This work here represents me, it represents the English department, and it represents the library. And so my critical eye had to be on constantly, anytime I reviewed my work. But thankfully, I was not alone. I'm a firm believer that nobody succeeds by themselves. Everyone arrives because of the help of others. And so many people had helped with this exhibit that I couldn't possibly do every single person justice. But there are people I definitely need to thank. For one, my parents. I want to thank my mom and dad for always supporting me, no matter if I didn't know where I was going, in school or in the pool. I played water polo here for 4 years, that's fine. I want to thank Sarah so much for being there at times when I was overly excited and you had just come home from a 12-hour nursing shift. I want to thank Carol, John Jackson, and Dr. Voyles for helping put this together and getting this event to fruition. I want to thank the English department for co-sponsoring this event, and I would like to thank the faculty and students in special collections who spent a whole year with me. And I would like to thank KJ, especially, for getting the help of the English department to co-sponsor this, and for literally everything since my freshman year till now. And two people in particular I really want to thank. The first is Jessica Guardado. She is the style of this whole exhibit. She is the colors. She worked on the posters, the videos, the book supports, like every small detail. That was her, and things that I could never do on my own. And so I really want to thank you for that. And lastly is, of course, our fearless leader, Cynthia Becht. She is amazing and has taught me so much and was always there and listened to every idea I had, no matter how outlandish it was. And I cannot thank you enough, and I appreciate everything you've done for me. Now, thinking that the exhibit is over is kind of weird for me, because I've been working on it for so long. And I was there when the vinyl went up on a Saturday morning over the summer at 9 a.m. and Cynthia had to let me into the library. It was closed. And watching it go up was fantastic. And then later on, being able to actually put the artifacts in their respective cases was both made me very happy, but also very sad, because it was the final end to this year-plus long project. But I had to ask myself, really, is anything in academia really over? Right? We're always analyzing, we're always critically looking at things, and we're always intaking new information. And so today, I really want to ask you, as you move through the exhibit today, immerse yourself in it. Have as much fun as I did making it, but at the same time, remember to critically look at it and take some new information home. Because as Twain himself says, if the reader thinks they are done now, and that this book has no moral, they are in error. Thank you.
So please join me in welcoming our next two speakers to the stage. We are going to have Traci Voyles, who is Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies, and KJ Peters, Professor of English, both here at the college, the BCAO College, to talk more about this exhibition. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you all for being here. I love being in this space, and I just want to take a moment to apologize to librarians in general and the library in particular that I'm always late in returning my books. I think that's probably my primary reputation whenever I'm in the library, and I always feel like I have well known for that particular trait.
Traci, we really don't care. I just want to tell you it's fine. It's really okay.
Okay, thank you. You should tell me that you care a lot. Okay. I want to speak for a few minutes. I'm really grateful for the invitation to be here. I want to thank Cynthia and Dom and KJ for making the space in this. And so I came a little bit later into the process, and I'm primarily an environmental historian and a U.S. Western historian, working in the Women's and Gender Studies department, and my primary fields are in Indigenous studies. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context and how the text Roughing It is received in Mark Twain's work in the West in particular. Because as Dom reminds us, Twain very much did make the West, and sometimes in interesting ways. And I think one of the things that I just want to preface by what I have to say today is to underscore the different ways in which different disciplines approach different texts. So those of you who are undergraduates and have all sorts of different classes with professors with all sorts of different disciplines, and they make you go out and find primary sources. And if you've noticed, all of your professors mean something different by that. And we also interpret primary sources in vastly different ways. So I see part of my role here is to provide the sort of historical interpretation of this as a primary source. And before I get going, I want to just offer a land acknowledgement to the Tongva Gabrielino people whose land we're on. So we're on unceded land, and Dom was referencing the event that we had the other day that was seeking to grapple with that particular part of our role here. All right, so I came into this exhibit because I was walking across campus a few weeks ago and saw a sign for an exhibit on Mark Twain's Roughing It. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I wonder what the project is here. And the reason that caught me in my eye is because Roughing It has a very particular reputation among historians, especially Western historians and Indigenous historians. And the part of that text that is most well known among Western historians is the ways in which it lends a Twain-sized megaphone to racist stereotypes about Native Americans that at the time when he was writing and publishing in the 1860s and the 1870s was fueling a full-scale genocide against tribes from the Intermontane West and in California in particular. So Twain's popularization of the digger stereotype of California Indians, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and the vulgar language that he used to describe Western Shoshone people has been widely cited as one of the many ways in which the genocide against natives in California became an accepted part of Western settler life. So in Twain's writing, natives are described as savages, cheats, cannibals, and murderers, or else as the lowest order of humanity, living off of dirt and laziness and filth. So certainly these stereotypes were popular among whites at the time, but scholars have explored how these depictions of natives were particularly influential in California, where settler campaigns of extermination, and extermination was the word that was used at the time, were underway at the time of Twain's writings, at the time of his publishing, and drew legitimacy from depictions of digger Indians and other natives as dirty, lazy, and evil. So the story that I want to start with today is really kind of the story of that process. And I'm really grateful that Don brought up the theme of Twain's relationship to California, because not only is there a relationship between Twain and the West that's often overlooked, but also very specifically, there are very specific connections. So the story that I want to tell today is really a story about Twain's connections to California. So like any good historian, I'm going to start by just laying out a scene for you. So on a frigid pre-dawn morning in late January of 1863, a Union Army officer named Colonel Patrick Edward Connor marched north into what is now Idaho, accompanied by hundreds of California militiamen. Together, they launched a surprise attack on a Western Shoshone community along the banks of the Bear River. Firing their rifles on sleeping families, the Army soldiers and their California compatriots murdered men, women, children, and elders as they fled their homes through the snow, and Shoshone men as they sought to stand against the barrage of Army rifles. By the time the sun was fully up at mid-morning, more than 300 Shoshone people lay dead or dying in the snow. Colonel Connor later declared that the full-scale assault on Shoshone from babies to grandparents was no accident, nor the escalation of heated tensions in battle. I had no intention, he reported, to take any prisoners. The time period of this horrific assault, which came to be known as the Bear River Massacre, is important, as are its major players. During the 1860s, violence against Native Americans in the West rose to the scale of genocide, with its instigators clearly articulating over and over again that their goal was that of extermination. State-sanctioned violence and extra-legal violence against Native people throughout the West was so intense and so sustained that the Bear River Massacre barely registers among the most deadly attacks on Native communities, even just during the Civil War years. That distinction goes to the Sand Creek Massacre, which I'm sure many of you have heard of Cheyenne and Arapaho people in Southern California in the following year, the winter of 1864. The fact that the perpetrators of the Bear River Massacre were mostly California men matters a great deal. From the inception of the American period, when General Fremont attacked a village of Patwin people on his way to join the Bear Flag Revolt at Fort Sutter, in the summer of 1846 to the beginning of the Civil War, Californians excelled at anti-Native violence with the aim of annihilation. Between 1850 and 1861, California militiamen killed more than 1,342 California Native people. Orphan children who survived these attacks were brought into white households as enslaved laborers. As best as can be estimated, California settlers, vigilantes, and militiamen violently killed at least 9,400 California natives between 1846 and 1873, a number that's based on years of research but is almost certainly an underestimate. Tens of thousands more died from exposure, starvation, epidemics, and overwork. To give a sense of the scale of this particular American genocide, before 1769, California was the most densely populated area of Native North America. Today, we rarely even think of California as being a place with an indigenous history. Between Spanish, Mexican, and American colonization, California native life endured some of the most violent, sustained, and intense attempts at genocide of anywhere on the continent. In total, from 1846, the beginning of the American period, to 1870, the population of Native Californians went from about 150,000 people to 30,000, an 80% decline in barely 24 years. The astounding scale of this violence committed against Native people west of the Rocky Mountains was matched by equally astounding racist rhetoric. Newspapers declared the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Miwok, the Modoc, and Ute people to be cannibals, animals, and liars, vile and worthless dregs of humanity, lower than any other nation of Native peoples in the U.S. Racist stereotypes converged into a single image of the Native people of the arid West. They were called the Digger Indians. So Digger referred to a stereotype that these people lived off what they could scratch from the ground, like animals. Digger stereotypes invoked poverty, slow-wittedness, and animality. Pigs and hogs were a frequent comparison to those people of the so-called Digger tribes. This is the West that Twain entered as Samuel Clemens in 1861. The Bear River Massacre took place 2 years after he arrived in Nevada. He described the Western Shoshone, who he called the Goshute, who were members of the same nation attacked at Bear River, as, quote, considerably inferior to even the despised Digger Indians of California, inferior to all races of savages on our continent, a silent, sneaking, treacherous-looking race, prideless beggars, savages, and alcoholics, a thin, scattering race of almost naked black children, who produce nothing at all, have no villages, and no gatherings together, a people whose only shelter is a rag cast on a bush to keep off a portion of the snow. As historian James Rawls put it in his highly influential text, Indians of California, it's hard to overestimate the importance of images like the one Twain reproduces in Roughing It. With those images in mind, the full horrible significance of the demand for the extermination of the California Indians can be understood. When we read these accounts, such as that of a newspaper in 1873, a California newspaper, which wrote that every Modoc be treated the same as a wild animal, or another newspaper that Californians hunted the Indians like wild beasts and shot them with as much nonchalance as though they were squirrels. We must hesitate before dismissing these words as hyperbole. These collective images, Rawls asserts, made, quote, Indian extermination and extinction palatable and even highly desirable, providing a reduction of the Indians of California to the level of beasts that filled a necessary precondition to their extermination, end quote. Perhaps ironically, Twain began this diatribe against the Western Shoshone by saying that they were even lower than the, quote, despised Digger Indians of California. And the reason that's ironic is because the term Digger was originally used in the 1820s against the Western Shoshone themselves, clumping them in with the other native nations of the Great Basin. So what's crucial to understand about this from a historical perspective is that none of this was uncontroversial. Vitriolic expressions of racism might have been more common in the written record and more accepted among polite and rough company alike in the 1860s than they are now. But genocide isn't the kind of thing that goes unnoticed or unremarked on, especially in a region that was, in the late 19th century, a relatively small world. By the time Mark Twain published Roughing It in 1872, he was aware of the scale and success of the violence he had witnessed in the West since the 1860s. Everyone was. California newspapers, including the Sacramento Union, which Twain worked for as a reporter, urged restraint now and again, and an ambivalent plea for the lives of Native people. No one paid much attention, in part because the weight of the state government was on their side. In 1850, the state of California mandated that all white men join militias. And in 1851 and 1852, the California state legislature issued payments equaling $1 million to pay the expenses of Indian hunters. Even more importantly, Twain himself was aware that in his depictions of Goshutes and other Native people, he was engaging in what Western historian Louis Warren calls artful deception. Twain's admitted purpose in lending such a large megaphone to the vilest of racist stereotypes of Native people was to counteract the effects of writers like James Fenimore Cooper, whose romantic noble savages invited people to fret perhaps too much about what was seen as Native people's inevitable demise. In fact, Twain gestured to the critique itself, narrating a feeling of having pity for Indians, but only from a distance. Nearer by, they never get anybody's pity, Twain wrote. For Twain, the only response to the noble savage literary type was to lean into the genre of realism and, quote, accept Native inferiority, end quote. The dichotomy between noble savage and Twain's description of degraded Shoshones puts me in mind of historian John Dower's quip that people of color can be seen as subhuman, or they can be seen as superhuman, but they are rarely perceived as being simply human. This is my final comment, I promise. So historian Ibram Kendi, who wrote a New York Times best-selling book called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, ventured a transformative thesis in that book. While we generally think of racism as rising out of what he calls the, quote, popular folktales of racism, the idea that ignorant and hateful people produce racist ideas, and these racist people then instituted racist policies. However, when you examine racism historically, that's almost never true. Rather, as Kendi points out, quote, time and again, racist ideas have not been cooked up from the boiling pot of ignorance and hate. Time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era, in order to redirect the blame for their era's racial disparities away from those policies and onto non-white people, end quote. California, other Western territories, and the U.S. itself in the 1860s had a racist policy of extermination of Native people. Through collective and individual acts of legal and extra-legal violence, they set about implementing that policy. This is how a group led by a Union Army colonel and populated by California volunteer militiamen came to massacre hundreds of Western Shoshone on a cold morning in January of 1863. The cultural work that went along with that violence to justify it as the natural outcome for people described as the lowest and most degraded of mankind, dirty, treacherous, and vile, fell to writers and politicians, speechmakers, and artists. That Mark Twain was among them, elevating them to the heights of the country's most celebrated writer. The fact that he engaged in this kind of vitriolic racism matters. It matters historically, it matters ethically, and it should matter to each and every one of us as we consider the legacy of his contributions to this version of the West.
Thank you, Traci. The historical context of not just this work, but many of the works of this time period and from many other writers is often overlooked. And in Mark Twain's case, well, in simple terms, Mark Twain's a problem. He's a problem in part because he's a conflicted character. This is a man who was able to awaken a society inured to the institution of slavery, to the humanity of slaves through his characterization of Jim. This is also a man who, as Traci's pointed out, not only wrote horrifically about indigenous populations, but also immigrants, Chinese, Mormon individuals, Mormon women, for some reason, attracted a great deal of his vitriol. And yet he's also praised as one of the greatest writers of America. So Mark Twain and Roughing It are problems, and yet they are also examples of American literature. Now, from a literary perspective, if you were to ask, let's say, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 50 years ago, what's the problem with Samuel Clemens' creations? Well, scholars looking only at the literary elements would say there's very little to object to. And unfortunately, that's because literary theories or literary criticism of Romanticism, followed by formalism and structuralism, and then new criticism, allowed literary scholars to ignore the historical context and ignore the social impact of his tall tales. Now, insulated literary analysis does not serve us, nor does it serve the complex text and the situated text that we must study and we must consider. So briefly this evening, and I'm going to be very brief, I'm kind of proud of how short this is. Briefly this evening, I want to examine two devices that Samuel Clemens used to demythologize the West and shape the disordered wilderness for readers around the world. And then we'll discuss later on some other issues. The first device is in fact Mark Twain. Now, Samuel Leghorn Clemens was born in November of 1835. Mark Twain was created in December of 1863, while Clemens was working as a reporter for the Daily Tutorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada. Significantly, this is the same time and region that Clemens encountered what he called the Goshen Indians, which were in fact the Shoshone. Now, initially, Mark Twain is a character that appears in his satirical travelogues, Roughing It, Innocents Abroad, A Tramp Abroad, Following the Equator. Now, clearly he inhabited Mark Twain later on, but initially he was a character, a narrator. Now, these texts establish the genre that can best be described as satirical travelogues. Now, from a literary perspective, Mark Twain, the narrator Roughing It, can be read as more mature Huck Finn, who says at the end of Huckleberry Finn, quote, "But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before." Now, before this famous line at the end of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer is the one who suggests the three of them, Tom, Huck, and Jim, quote, "go for a howling adventure amongst the Indians over in the territory." Mark Twain then, perhaps informed by this ambition to light up for the territory, can stand in for readers who dreamed at the time of seeing the uncivilized openness of the West, but could not themselves light up for the territory. In other words, before he becomes an innocent abroad, in Roughing It, Mark Twain is an innocent in the territories. Now, of course, this innocent, this narrative kind of perspective is obviously a fabrication. Now, Clemens' travelogues are composed of distinctions between Twain's observations and those who speak as experts of the country and the people he encounters along the way, typically resulting in the lampooning and ridicule of the experts and the knowledge they pass on through their books. Now, being a confessed tenderfoot, as Twain does, contributes to the authority of Mark Twain's observations, in the same way that being an admitted liar and a sinner makes Huck Finn believable. As outcasts and strangers in a culture they were not raised in, their observations can be taken as truth, even if they are salted with the occasional tall tale. Now, we're going to return to this idea of ethos by way of degradation, or putting yourself down makes you more believable. We'll return to this idea a little bit. Now, earlier I said Clemens demythologized the West, which may seem to contradict the subtitle of the exhibit. In fact, the myths derived from Mark Twain's observations displaced an earlier set of myths that Traci referred to. These myths were informed by writers such as Alexander Pope, Benjamin Franklin, Fenimore Cooper, as well as the paintings of Benjamin West and George Catlin. Now, the idealized noble savage, a person close to nature, uncorrupted by civilization, representing the innate goodness of humanity, was one of the early myths of the West that Twain worked to rewrite. Now, anyone who's read Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, penned by Mark Twain, or read chapter 19 of Roughing It, has a sense of Twain reworking to displace Cooper and his portrayal of the frontier West, and most specifically, the noble savage. So let's turn now to Roughing It and look at the second device that Twain uses to bring order to the disordered West. And this one is his most famous satire. In chapter 5, Twain describes the desert coyote. Quote, "The coyote is a living, breathing allegory of want. He is always hungry, he is always poor, out of luck and friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even the fleas would desert him for a velocipede, bicycle. Though not funny, the suggestion that a flea would prefer to ride a bicycle rather than feed on a coyote is an example of Twain's satire. Now, to refresh our memories, because satire is one of those slippery terms that kind of hard to grasp. Satire is a mode of expression that exposes the failings and flaws of an individual, institution, or society to ridicule or scorn. For example, satire is the jerk that laughs too loudly when you trip and fall, drawing everyone's attention. Satire can also be Twain making fun of his own Eastern kind of style of clothing amongst the 49ers in the mountains, and satiring his own inability to fit in. Now, in the example of the coyote, satire sorts and ranks, creating a hierarchy of the West. In the mind, allegedly, of a parasite, a bicycle is superior to a coyote. Significantly, the parasite is more despised than the coyote, just as the tenderfoot Twain is more despised is despised by the 49ers. Now, this is not to say that Twain's a parasite, but it is to highlight, again, this notion of building ethos through self-degradation, or putting yourself down to appear more trustworthy. With satire as a sorting device in mind, consider the associations Twain then makes at the end of chapter 5. It is considered that the coyote and the Indian of the desert testify to their blood kinship with each other, that they live together in the waste places of the earth on terms of perfect confidence and friendship, while hating all creatures and yearning to assist at their funerals. Now, the satirical ranking of flea, coyote, velocipede now serves to rank the indigenous through Twain's associations. As you have heard these quotations, you may have already made the association of the velocipede with the stagecoach that carries Twain and his brother through the first 22 chapters of Roughing It. The stagecoach at the time, a symbol of civilization, modernity, and the ambition that has tamed the West. In summary, Clemens demystifies the West with journalistic skills, prejudiced observations, and tall tales, but in doing so, he created the innocent, Mark Twain, and developed a genre that stratified the uncertain openness of the West. Satire was a sorting tool. Roughing It became the new myth of the West, displacing romantic myth of the noble savages and brave frontiermen who were seen as allies, with new heroes and codes that celebrated violence, patriarchy, maligned the indigenous, the immigrants, the Mormon faith, and the women. Thank you. I got a guess. So now we're going to ask each other questions. I have a question.
We're going to ask each other questions.
Yes, right. Can I start?
Yes, absolutely.
6:30. We have the roast in the oven, so we got to get going. 7 minutes.
We have 7 minutes.
So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask first.
Okay.
I've mentioned some of the challenges that Mark Twain, specifically Roughing It, as well as other texts, presents to literary scholars. Fortunately, we're in a time now where the cultural studies, new historicism, rhetorical hermeneutics takes a more thorough, thick look. Still, Twain and teaching Roughing It is a problem. So from a historical perspective, can you help me teach this book? How would you teach? How would you teach Roughing It in a history class?
Well, it's funny. That's a good question that we drafted together a couple of days ago. I love this question. Well, so yeah, I have taught passages from Roughing It before, and I think that all of that has to do with what kind of context you provide, which I think you spoke to really beautifully in terms of thinking about the literary form, right? So for me, I situate it in terms of providing different sorts of angles of vision about what's going on in the West, right? Because these can help students sort of engage with different epistemological trajectories. that I think are really useful. So if we're looking at sort of late 19th century accounts of, in one of my classes, sort of indigenous and settler encounters in the West, I would say that, just 9 years later, Helen Hunt Jackson published A Century of Dishonor, which is a full-throated indictment of the violence that had been inflicted on Californian natives. So I think pairing those together within 9 years of each other is really effective, or you could teach Ramona if you just desperately want to, which was published in 1884. And in addition to that, sort of to triangulate those texts, there are Native authored texts that were published in the same decade that provide these kinds of perspectives. In particular, Sarah Winnemucca's Life Among Paiutes is considered to be the first Native woman's autobiography. And that is a Great Basin kind of representation. So those are the kind of contexts that I think students help students engage with primary sources in ways where you can see that the worldview that's carried around in the head of the author shapes how the narrative plays out. And then there's a wide variety of secondary sources. In particular, a lot of the analysis that Indigenous historians have gleaned about Roughing It come from Ned Blackhawk's Violence Over the Land, which is an excellent text to pair with Roughing It. Okay.
Students, you'll write those down.
Yeah, he's everybody's taking notes.
Very good.
So I
we have like 5 minutes.
We have 5
Should we
minutes,
open it
okay.
to them, or
We should
should
probably
we?
do that.
Can I escape your question?
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. You're not going to answer my question.
If there, she writes better questions than I. Do you have questions? And if so, I can avoid her question. No. Please.
Yes. I'm just curious as to what, if any, economic advantages accompanied the massacre of the indigenous peoples. In other words, was it a question of land possession? Was that a factor at all? Or was it just wanting to kill people that were in the way kind of a thing?
So the most indelicate answer to your question is a little bit of both. In particular, the Bear River Massacre occurred because the Civil War outposts that were happening in the West were an attempt by the Union Army and the federal government to protect trade routes and migrant trails. So that the federal government could maintain, in the absence of Twitter, could maintain connections to California, which was considered the vast economic resource of the Union states, right? So Colonel Connor engaged in that violence in the context of protecting the overland mail route. And there's a lot of precipitating events that I'd be happy to talk about, but I feel like, does that answer your question?
I think so. Would the same thing apply to the transcontinental railway construction in terms of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, the railroad was deliberately used as a way of bisecting the Plains tribes reservations that had been guaranteed by treaty. And so if you've all seen the popular... you don't have to raise your hand for this, but if you've seen Dances with Wolves, you remember the famous scenes of slaughtering the bison. So there's a massive bison extermination, and that was a project of clearing the plains for the railroad. So those projects really went hand in hand.
Can I add to that?
Absolutely.
Again, literary scholar. But I know my classes, my students are often surprised that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that many of the motivations that led the colonists to first venture west and keep from the seaboard, and then breach the Cumberland Pass, and then continue to expand, were the same all the way along. Land, resources, transportation, water. And from the first leap off of the seaboard to hitting the Pacific, same motivations. We, unfortunately, more and more people, more and more technology made the bloodshed greater.
Go ahead, Dawn.
This is not a question. I just wanted to add something to what you both just said, but also the way in which the West is constantly redefined, right? The West moves westward. So the original West is actually well east of the Mississippi. And the same sort of dynamics at every turn accompany that sort of westward push of what we think of as the West. So the West was constantly remade, but many of the same dynamics, especially the ways in which it rested on the displacement and extermination of indigenous peoples, were part of that process all along. Because we think of the West
as settled.
well, yeah, and that it's always been in the same place, right? But there are multiple Wests in American history.
Yeah, Frederick Jackson Turner, which is an essay you should read, as problematic as it is, it ignores a great deal of the consequences of his theory. But the central metaphor of this rolling wave from east to west, and the wave renews and is motivated, it causes the same kind of recurring structures of domination and dispossession. He doesn't talk about that part, but the recurrence of the same motivations and the same consequences, that central metaphor still holds. Keep in mind, the frontier was a moving line. It was never static.
And just to riff off of that, it actually is a deeply American logic in the sense that it's actually part of the Jeffersonian vision for what makes it for American exceptionalism. So Thomas Jefferson organized his notions of what made America unique and great, in part because of the democracy of having lots and lots of land to settle, and that meant that all of a father's sons could be eventually landowners, which wasn't true in other parts of the world, right? So the fact of property ownership that would contribute to this democratic project required both constant movement west, it required that constant movement of that frontier line, and the constant racial violence of dispossession. Later, it would also mean populating those dispossessed lands with enslaved labor to profit off of the land in that way. So that kind of Jeffersonian ideal, there's a direct line between Jefferson and Frederick Jackson Turner that Western historians grapple with quite a lot.
So apparently we have time for one more question. Oh, way back here.
Hello. What are some devices that you believe we use today to bury this history for the layman? I mean, Dr. Peters often, I'm in your class, we often employ myth to do so, and that's the one that we constantly try and draw back towards. But for anyone who's kind of unaware of this history or unaware of the devices that have been used to bury this history, what are some that you think, both of you think, that we have used as a society to do so?
Let me give you a very specific example, one that I experienced as a student. I was taught new criticism. And the idea of new criticism was everything you needed to make an interpretation of a text was in the text itself. You never needed to look out of the text. You didn't need historical knowledge. You didn't even need any special skill other than to read, to think, and focus on the evidence provided by the text. All the way through college, that was what I was taught. And that allows for, I mean, imagine reading Roughing It and never considering that to go shoot is in fact an insulting term. And it is a derogatory term itself, but not even attending to that. It's not really relevant to the style, the symbolism of the book. So there's a very specific example of a literary theory designed to enlighten and educate that does so by covering up a majority of the situation, the situatedness of the text. And even now, there are people still writing new criticism interpretations. So that's one that comes to mind quickly.
That's great. Yeah, I thought that was really useful.
Oh, here you
Well,
go.
please join me in
Here goes
thanking, yes. Thank you, Dr. Voyles. Thank you, Dr. Peters, very much for sharing your expertise and preparation and time with us and your thoughts. And obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of this conversation. So we have an entire hour worth of time to continue the conversation out in the gallery. And we do want to make sure that you have some time to thoughtfully explore the exhibition. So at this point, please join me in thanking our speakers.